Welcome to Thursdays with Troy, everybody. I'm Troy Lambert. I'm a mystery author, editor, and super Plottr user. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to Sybilla Nash, who will be talking about rewriting your novel using Plottr. I'm really excited about this because, of course, once you've written your novel, once you've gotten that first draft done and you've used Plottr to create that, you have to polish your novel before it goes to an editor, even definitely before you publish. And if you're planning to traditionally publish, definitely before it goes to a publisher or an agent. You really want to make sure that your manuscript and your novel is in the best shape it possibly can be. So welcome, Sybilla. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Troy. Let's see. Well, I'm happy to be here, so thank you for having me. I write women's fiction, science fiction, and I'm currently working on and will be discussing a middle grade fantasy novel. So, I'm also a freelance writer, so I do articles and, nonfiction work. So a little bit of run the gamut of what I write.
Yes, I work freelance as well, so we get to write on all kinds of interesting topics, and I find that provides additional fodder for novels. So obviously you've outlined your books in Plottr ahead of time, I'm assuming, so you're somewhat of a plotter anyway?
Actually, I'm a pantser. So it's funny because, I saw Plottr, I was like, oh, this will be great because it's so much more efficient to be able to plot your books. And that way, at the end of it, as with my middle grade, I'm like, there are holes in there. So it was so helpful to go back and be able to plot it out on Plottr and see the deficiencies where I needed to add this or add that or whatever. But yeah, I'll try and plot and then I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this. And they wind up looking nothing like the outline that I'll create. So yeah, I'm a little bit of a plotzer, pantser, a little bit of both.
Right. A friend of mine calls it being a plantster, where you kind of plan it out, but it doesn't always work out the way the plan. So, but basically, so you're using Plottr to revise your novel. So let's talk a little bit about how you got that idea, and then we're going to share your screen, and you can tell us a little bit about how you did it with this particular file.
Sure. So I had this novel, and I was working on it and trying to figure out the next steps for it. And so it's taking revision workshops and things like that. And I already had Plottr, and I was using it to plot other, stories from the ground up. And I was like, oh, okay, one of the things that we had to do with the revisions course is to take stickies and write out every scene, plot point. So I was like, why not do this on Plottr? Because it's, you can move it around. It's easier. You're not going to have more notes in there, rather than dealing just with a sticky. So that's kind of where it came from. It's just going through the novel page by page and breaking down the scenes and putting them into Plottr so that I can kind of see the structure of the novel right there.
So now we'll kind of move into your file. So here we'll share your file. And you can tell us maybe how you started with this.
I went in through the template of doing just breaking it down into the 3-act structure. And then one of the books that I was reading, Darcy Patterson's Revise Your Novel Revision, it's talking about the emotions that each chapter has and to look at, okay, what is your chapter conveying? So I just went back and put up some of the emotions for each chapter to kind of see the progression. And then I went through act 1, what happened, the prologue, what happens, the chapters, and just put in the different scenes based on the acts, and went through it that way. And so then it was easier to kind of see oh, okay, I'm missing I need more action here, or I need to include something, in this chapter. So it was really great to be able to see just the bones of the story, where it was lacking, or if it was too much, and be able to move things around.
Right. And that is fantastic how you have that file, how you have your timelines into the acts. I see you've got 4 acts. So you started with a 3-act structure and then maybe added in a 4th act, or how did that come about?
So I started the 3-act structure, and then I think I was following the book and added in the 4th, just trying to get some type of structure to the story, because it was like I wrote it like pantsing, like, oh, this will be great. And, you just kind of like, right, that first draft is just like that everything draft. You put everything in it, and then you look at it and say, oh, what is this? How do I get into shape so I can send it out to an editor and beta readers?
Gotcha. So how many chapters did you end up with overall? Out of curiosity.
It's funny because I went through it a couple of times, and I have about 20 chapters. I'm still revising it, working off of this, but I wound up, I think I started with like 24, and then I kind of like condensed them because they were too long, and then they were too short. So I played, this has been great to play around with what do I want the structure of the book to look like? So that was great to be able to have like, oh, I can start and try like do 20 chapters, and oh, maybe I want to do 24 and move things over, but I wound up with about 18.
Now, so this is middle grade. What did your word count ended up being, and how did that impact how you divided up the chapters?
Well, that's a great question, because it was the first draft was very thin. So the first draft was about 29,000 words, and it's like, which is, a middle grade can be anywhere between like 40 to 60, I think. So I was striving for 40, and I got up to 39, and I'm still working on it. So I think it's going to wind up to be around 40, 42, somewhere around there. So being able to plot it out, I was able to, include an additional 10,000 words in there, because it was thin, and I knew it was thin, but I was like, okay, where is it lacking? Where do I need to, add to it? Where does the story need more? So yeah, it's at 39,000 words, which is still, it's a trilogy. So it's still not, like a big book, but I think for this story, it works.
Right, exactly. A little short for a novel, a little long for a novella, but middle grade, you got a lot of leeway to play around with. And so in your revision process, did you keep the chapters pretty even and move the scenes around to make the chapters a similar length?
I tried to keep them like similar length, but then I also want to make sure that the ending. So, I'd go through and like, okay, well, how am I ending each chapter? So that like pushes, you have that cliffhanger, and it can kind of like propel you into the next chapter. So it's like I had to break up chapters 1 and 2, because chapter 1 and make it into 2, because that was pretty lengthy, and there was like a natural point where it could go into chapter 2. So being able to look at it and see like, oh, okay, well, I can like break this up here.
Did you just kind of move scenes around so there was a natural hook into the next chapter, or was that something you'd kind of already written into the story?
The first draft, I did try it, I consciously was trying to write the hooks in there, but it was short, with the 29,000 words. So going back over it and the revisions, it's like, okay, I can move this hook here, or I can extend this chapter there. So it was some rehabbing of some of the chapters to make sure that it flowed, that, it wasn't too long, and that there was like a natural type of hook that would take you into the next chapter. So if I had to break it up and then like, do a hook or just make it more interesting. So it's like, oh, what happens next? I could do that. But just being able to like say like, oh, okay. And some of it too is like, oh, I'll do this, I can take this out. Or, that was the good part also.
Right. So let's say we open the scene card at the end of one of the chapters, if you click on one of those, and then kind of tell us about how that hooks into the next chapter, if you want to grab an example.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll start with chapter 1. So she's chased by a dragon, and this doesn't have the scene notes.
Well, and obviously being chased by a dragon is a pretty good,
exactly.
to the next chapter, because I'm assuming that doesn't resolve in the end of that chapter.
Yeah, and so for a lot of them too, it's like I wrote down the scenes, but because the book was already written, I didn't have to go in and do too much in terms of like notes. Yeah, so I don't have a lot of scene notes in there, because I'm just going back to Scrivener and looking at how it's set up there, and I can go in there. Part of it, which I, was not able to do in Scrivener, is like with the characters. So I did enjoy having my notes with my characters and putting in the pictures and kind of like playing around with that. I just love how all this comes together. You can just really build out this world.
So let me ask you another question related to Plottr as far as about your series itself. So obviously this is the first of a trilogy. Are you planning to drop the other ones in the same Plottr under the project file, even as you do the rewriting process?
Right. I just put in like, the titles of the books, and then, once I get this one finished, then I can go back in and then add them so that, I'll have my series all under, this umbrella.
Have you developed, now it's another question, I'm putting you on the spot. Have you developed a series timeline, like what the timeline of the series is going to look like? Or have you thought about that?
No, I haven't thought about that yet, but that's a great question. I mean, it's like I have like, like the general idea of like how the series, the second and third books, what they'll be like and how the series ends, but I haven't created like the general timeline. And then also too, like the arcs. So it's like I'm starting to like work out like what's the arc of the overall series and things like that. So it's like it's a work in progress.
Excellent, excellent. And so I did ask you about characters. Have you done the same things with settings or no? As far as your places, have you pulled those into Plottr, or are you kind of keeping those in Scrivener? Or?
I've kept them in Scrivener for now, but I'm going to pull them into Plottr because it will be like a larger part of the story. So I've like started research, like I want to research castles and things like that and really build out this land, because I think that's part of what, the current draft is missing. More of just like making that land more 3D and more believable. So, I'm starting to do the research and I'll start pulling it in so that, the land itself is almost a character.
Well, that is fantastic. Is there anything else about the revising process that you want people to know that you kind of want to share with them?
Sure. I mean, it's one of those things like where, you're going to go through so many revisions. So it's good to be able to like move things around and just to be able to look at it and pull back from your story to give it like that bird's eye view. When you get that up close view and you're too close to it, but if you can pull back and then look at the structure and say, okay, does it look even? Just from that structural point. So it's like the revision process using Plottr is just, it's helped me in so many ways, because that's always the hardest part for me. It's like, okay, now how do I, that saggy middle, the middles are hard for me. I have the beginnings and the endings, but the middle of the story, which is like the bulk of the story. So being able to work it out on Plottr makes such a difference in my writing process.
Right. One thing that I always tell people, I write mysteries, people like, how did you know at the beginning that that clue needed to be there? And I'm like, I didn't know that. I went back and added it later, but the reader never has to know when you added something to the story. So that's a good point about that, is in the revision process, you can prop up that sagging middle and nobody has to know that your first draft, it sagged just horribly. So, that's a good thing to know, and those are good things to share. And I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Now, I did promise you, and we always do have kind of a final question, because we're trying to solve the world's problems by asking authors these things. And so it's very much about the definition of a word, because it's very important that when we're talking about things that words have the proper definition. So my question for you is a hot dog a sandwich?
Is a hot dog a sandwich?
I mean,
well, I'm going to say yes.
It's meat between two pieces of bread. It might depend on where you're from, but a hot dog is a sandwich. It's a form of a sandwich. So all of you look for Sybilla's social media and for her website, and follow her and chase your run. And thank you very much for sharing your process with us and for sharing this time with you.
Thank you for having me.
We really do appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.